Stand on the banks of the Tigris River in Baghdad tonight, and you will see young people drinking tea, string lights glowing on cafe terraces, a city of 8 million trying to live an ordinary evening. Now understand this. 1,200 years ago, on this exact riverbank, stood what may have been the largest city on earth. A city so hungry for learning that legend claims its scholars were paid the weight of their books in gold. A city whose thinkers helped give the world algebra, the algorithm, and the numbers glowing on your phone screen right now. Then, in one terrible week in the year 1258, an army arrived, and witnesses claimed the river itself ran black with the ink of drowned books. This is the story of Baghdad, the city that was once the center of human knowledge, the city that was broken, and the city that refuses, even now, to stop reading. More than 13 centuries. One river. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Circle in the Desert. Most great cities in history happened by accident. Rome grew out of a cluster of villages on 7 hills. London began as a Roman river crossing that simply refused to die. Paris started as a settlement on an island in the Seine. These cities were not planned. They accumulated, century after century. Like coral, Baghdad belongs to a rarer family. It was one of the most ambitious, purpose-built capitals of the medieval world. A city whose walls, gates, and streets were drawn on the ground before a single family moved in, and according to the traditions preserved by its historians, even its birthday was calculated in advance. To understand why, we have to go back to the middle of the 8th century, to a revolution that had just shaken the Islamic world. In the year 750, a family called the Abbasids overthrew the ruling dynasty, the Umayyads, and took control of an empire that stretched from North Africa to the borders of India. It was, at that moment, among the largest empires on the planet. But it had a problem. Its old capital, Damascus, was the city of the dynasty it had just destroyed. The Abbasids needed a fresh start. A capital with no past and no old loyalties. They needed to build one from nothing. The man who made the decision was the second Abbasid Caliph, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. His name means the victorious, and he earned it. He was ruthless, brilliant, and famously careful with money. Chroniclers describe him reviewing construction budgets personally, line by line, and in the year 762, after searching up and down the rivers of Iraq, al-Mansur chose a spot on the west bank of the Tigris, near a small village that already carried an old name, Baghdad. Why here? Look at a map, and the choice starts to explain itself. At this point, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the 2 great rivers of Mesopotamia, swing close enough together that canals had connected them since ancient times. Whoever held this spot held a water highway linking the Mediterranean world to the Persian Gulf. And from the Gulf to India and China, ships could reach here from almost anywhere. Grain from the river valleys could feed a city of almost any size. The chroniclers report al-Mansur telling his advisors that this was the perfect crossroads, that the goods of the whole world could come to him by water. And there was something deeper. This was not empty land. This was Mesopotamia, the oldest urban landscape on Earth. Some 55 miles to the south lay the ruins of Babylon, the wonder of the ancient world. About 20 miles downstream stood the crumbling palace of Ctesiphon, the old capital of the Persian Empire, with a brick vault so enormous it still stands today. When al-Mansur founded Baghdad, he was not writing on a blank page. He was adding a new chapter to the oldest book in the world. Some accounts even claim his builders carried bricks away from Ctesiphon itself. The new capital quietly recycling the old one. Now comes the detail that gives this city its legend. According to the Arabic historians, before construction began, al-Mansur consulted court astrologers, including a Persian scholar named Naubakht, to select the most favorable date to break ground. Historians treat the story with appropriate care. But think about what it meant to the people who told it. In their memory, the birthday of this city was not an accident. It was chosen. The way we schedule a rocket launch today. The date preserved by tradition falls in the summer of 762. The design itself was radical. Al-Mansur ordered a round city, a circle roughly 1.5 miles across, with massive concentric walls. Medieval writers claim the outer wall was so thick that a horseman could ride along the top of it. 4 gates pierced the circle at equal distances, and each gate was named for the destination its road pointed toward. The Kufa Gate, the Basra Gate, the Damascus Gate, and facing the northeast, toward the rising sun and the long road into Central Asia. The Khurasan Gate stand at the center of Baghdad, and the 4 gates were compass needles pointing at the entire empire. Remember that 4th gate, the one facing east. 5 centuries from now, it will matter again, in the darkest chapter of this story. And what stood at the center of the circle? Not markets, not houses. At the exact heart stood only the Caliph's palace with its famous green dome, and the great mosque beside it. Power and faith, alone in a vast open space, with the city arranged in rings around them. Historians note that the circular plan echoed older Persian royal cities, and that is probably where the idea came from. But few cities had ever attempted it at this scale. This was geometry as a statement of power. If you were a visiting ambassador in the 8th century, walking through ring after ring of walls toward that green dome, the message reached you before anyone spoke a word. The center of the world intends to live here now. The construction effort was staggering. The historian al-Tabari, writing about a century later, reports that around 100,000 workers, engineers, and craftsmen were gathered from across the empire. Medieval chroniclers loved big, round numbers, so treat the figure with care. But even cautious modern accounts describe one of the largest building projects of the age. Bricklayers from the old towns of Iraq, carpenters from Syria, surveyors who traced the Great Circle on the ground, and then, according to one famous account, had the outline marked in ash and set alight, so the Caliph could see his city glowing on the dark earth before a single brick was laid. Whether or not that scene happened exactly that way, it tells you how people remembered this moment. A city born in a ring of fire. Al-Mansur gave his creation an official name, Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace. It was meant to evoke paradise. History, as we will see, had other plans for that name. The people never really used it anyway. They kept calling the place by the name of the old village, Baghdad, and it stuck for the next 1300 years. Here is the comparison that puts it all in scale. When the first residents moved inside those round walls, Charlemagne had not yet been crowned in Europe. London was a modest trading settlement. Rome had shrunk far below its ancient size, with sheep grazing among the old monuments. And here, on the banks of the Tigris, a brand new capital was rising, according to a plan, in rings of brick, at the crossroads of 3 continents. Within about 50 years of its founding, that capital would grow beyond anything its founder imagined, spilling far outside the circle, jumping the river, swelling into one of the great cities of the world, and, by some estimates, the greatest of all. The man who ruled it at that dazzling height was a caliph whose name still drifts through every telling of the 1001 Nights. a ruler whose court became a legend while he was still alive. To meet him, we walk out through the Khorasan Gate and into the Golden Age. Chapter 2. The richest city on earth. Every city has one generation that defines it forever. For Athens, it was the age of Pericles. For Rome, the age of Augustus. For Baghdad, it was the reign of the fifth Abbasid Caliph, a man named Harun al-Rashid, who ruled from 786 to 809. If you have ever heard a story from the 1001 Nights, you have already met him. He appears in those tales again and again, wandering his city in disguise at night, a caliph slipping unseen through the streets of the richest place he knew. The stories are legend. The wealth was real. Let's try to grasp the scale of it. By around the year 800, Baghdad had outgrown its original round walls many times over. The city had jumped the river, sprawling across both banks of the Tigris, connected by bridges built on rows of floating boats. Modern historians estimate the population somewhere between several 100,000 and 1 million people, depending on how the city's sprawling edges are counted. Even at the low end of that range, Baghdad stood among the very largest cities on earth, and quite possibly at the top of the list. Now put that next to Western Europe in the same year. Paris, at the time, held perhaps 25,000 people. London was smaller still. Baghdad was larger than any individual city in Western Europe, and not by a little, perhaps by an enormous margin. When Europeans of that century imagined a truly great city, they were imagining something most of them would never see. The people of Baghdad lived in one. What did that wealth look like on the ground? The chroniclers describe markets that specialized to a degree that sounds almost modern. A street of goldsmiths, a market for paper and books, a market for Chinese silk and porcelain, goods that had traveled 5,000 miles to get there. There were merchants selling furs from the far north, brought down the rivers of Russia by Viking traders. Hold that image for a second. Viking fur traders and Chinese silk merchants doing business in the same city, more than 1,000 years ago. And this is not just a colorful story. Archaeologists have found tens of thousands of Abbasid silver coins buried in hoards across Scandinavia. Physical proof of a trade network that connected the Baltic Sea to the Tigris River. The money flowed from everywhere. Taxes from an empire covering millions of square miles. Tolls from the river trade. And the caliph sat at the center of it like the sun at the center of the solar system. The palace household of Harun al-Rashid became a byword for luxury that Europe would not match for centuries. His wife Zubaydah, according to the chroniclers, would tolerate no cup at her table that was not made of gold or silver, studded with gems. When she made the pilgrimage to Mecca, she paid for a chain of wells and reservoirs along the entire desert route. A piece of infrastructure so famous it carried her name for 1,000 years. And here is a detail that Western audiences rarely hear. Harun al-Rashid and Charlemagne, the two most powerful rulers of their age, knew about each other. The Frankish chronicles record embassies traveling between them. And around the year 802, gifts from Harun reached Charlemagne's court. Silks, perfumes, an elaborate water clock made of brass. A machine so sophisticated that, according to the Frankish account, figures emerged from little doors to mark the hours. And one gift that no one in Europe could stop talking about. An elephant. His name was Abul Abbas. And after a long journey by sea and land, he eventually crossed the Alps to Charlemagne's capital at Aachen, where he lived for years as the most famous animal on the continent. Notice what those gifts were saying. Charlemagne's court remembered the embassy for generations. On Baghdad's side of the exchange, the Arabic chronicles barely mention it at all. For Harun, the greatest king in Western Europe was simply one more distant ruler to be politely impressed. That silence tells you more about the balance of power in the year 800 than any battle could. But the real wealth of Baghdad was never the gold. It was the sheer concentration of human energy. A city of that size, sitting at the crossroads of the world's trade routes, becomes a machine for collecting people. Poots came because the Caliph paid for poetry the way modern billionaires pay for art. Musicians came. Physicians came from Persia and India. Merchants came from 3 continents. And with the merchants and the physicians and the poets came something quieter. Something that would matter far more in the long run. Books came. Ideas came. Questions came. Because Harun al-Rashid did not just collect treasure. He collected knowledge. And he passed that hunger to his sons. Within a generation of his death, that hunger would flower into the most celebrated intellectual movement of the entire medieval world. An age when the wealth of an empire was poured into an older and stranger kind of treasure. The kind written on paper. The age of gold was becoming the age of wisdom. Chapter 3. The House of Wisdom. Here is a question worth sitting with. What is the most valuable thing a civilization can buy? Al-Mansur built walls. Harun al-Rashid built palaces. But the Abbasids are not remembered today for walls or palaces. Almost nothing of either survives. They are remembered because, at the height of their power, they spent their fortune on something few empires had ever purchased at this scale. They bought knowledge from every civilization they could reach. The institution at the heart of this memory is known to history as Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. And before we go further, an honest note, because this story deserves honesty. Historians still debate what the House of Wisdom actually was. Popular retellings describe a grand academy with observatories and lecture halls. A medieval university where all the world's learning sat under one roof. Scholars working from the surviving sources urge caution. And many argue it began as something more modest. A palace library with a staff of scholars and translators, whose image grew grander with each retelling over the centuries. The physical building is gone, and the records are thin. So in this story, we will treat the House of Wisdom as what the evidence best supports. Not a single magic building, but the most famous symbol of something much bigger and very well documented. A translation movement, supported by caliphs, courtiers, physicians, merchants, and private patrons across Baghdad, that set out to carry the knowledge of other civilizations into Arabic. That movement is one of the best documented facts of the age, and it changed the world. It reached its peak under Harun's son, the Caliph al-Mamun, who ruled from 813 to 833. Al-Mamun was something rare in history, a ruler genuinely obsessed with ideas. The chroniclers describe him holding debates at court where scholars of different faiths argued philosophy in front of the throne. And one famous story, recorded in the Arabic sources, claims that al-Mamun demanded an unusual item in his dealings with the Byzantine Empire. Not only gold, but books, copies of Greek manuscripts sitting in Constantinople, works of philosophy and science that the Byzantines themselves had largely stopped reading. Whether that story is precisely true or polished by time, it captures the policy perfectly. Baghdad treated books the way other empires treated territory. Something to be acquired. The scale of the translation movement is hard to exaggerate, even after all our caution. Over roughly 2 centuries, the major works of Greek science and philosophy were carried into Arabic. Aristotle, Euclid's geometry, Ptolemy's astronomy, Galen's medicine, Persian works on statecraft and astronomy came in. Indian works on mathematics and medicine came in. The modern historian Dimitri Gutas, who wrote the standard study of this movement, stresses a remarkable point. This was not a fringe project by a few bookish men. It was embraced by the whole elite of the empire. Rulers, officials, and wealthy families, who competed to sponsor translations, the way Renaissance princes would later compete to sponsor painters. The most famous of the translators was a Christian physician named Hunayn ibn Ishaq. Read that again, because it matters. The star translator of the Islamic Empire's greatest intellectual project was a Christian, working alongside Muslim, Jewish, and Sabian colleagues. Hunayn was a scholarly machine. He would reportedly track down multiple Greek manuscripts of the same text and compare them line by line to establish an accurate version before translating a single word, which is essentially the method modern textual scholars still use. Later accounts claim that translators of his rank were rewarded lavishly, and one much-loved tradition, the same one we heard in our opening, says translations were paid for with their weight in gold. Scholars debate whether that was literal practice or admiring legend, and legend is the safer bet. But the truth underneath it is solid. In 9th century Baghdad, translation was prestigious, well-funded work, and the men who did it brilliantly became wealthy and famous. Now, none of this would have mattered nearly as much without a quiet technological revolution happening at the same time. Paper. For centuries, the Mediterranean world had written on papyrus, which was fragile, and parchment, which was animal skin and brutally expensive. A single large parchment book could require the skins of an entire herd. Then the secret of papermaking arrived from China. A widely repeated tradition says it came through Chinese prisoners captured at the Battle of Talas in 751. Modern historians suspect the truth was more gradual, spreading along the trade routes through Central Asia. What is certain is the result. By the late 8th century, Baghdad had paper mills, and the chroniclers record an entire market street, the Souk al-Warakin, the stationer's market, lined with shops selling paper and books. Paper did for Baghdad something like what the printing press would later do for Europe. It crashed the price of the written word. Suddenly, a book was not a treasure locked in a palace. It was a product, copied by professional scribes, sold in shops, owned by ordinary educated families. Private libraries multiplied across the city, and this is the real magic of the age. Once the legends are set aside, not one perfect library, however grand, but a whole society where a merchant's son could walk into a market and buy Aristotle. Step back and look at what had gathered in one city: Greek logic and geometry, Persian astronomy and administration, Indian mathematics, Syriac scholarship carrying centuries of learning from the churches of the East, Chinese papermaking. Each of these traditions was powerful on its own, and other great centers. Alexandria in its day, the Persian Academy at Gundashapur, had brought some of them together before. But 9th century Baghdad became one of history's greatest meeting places for all of them at once. In one language, with an empire's wealth behind the introductions. And when ideas meet like that, they do not just sit on shelves, they breed. The scholars of Baghdad did not stop at translating what the ancients had known. They started checking it, correcting it, pushing past it. Ptolemy gave a figure for the size of the earth. Al-Mamun's astronomers went out into the flat desert plains and measured a degree of latitude for themselves. Galen described how the body worked. The physicians tested his claims against what they actually saw in the sick rooms of Baghdad. That restless, skeptical, hands-on spirit was about to produce a generation of thinkers whose fingerprints are on the device you are using right now. One of them was a quiet mathematician whose very name, mangled by Latin tongues over the centuries, became the word we now use for the invisible procedures that run the modern world. What did he actually do to earn that? The answer is the next part of our story. Chapter 4. The Men Who Invented the Future. Pick up your phone and look at the screen. The numbers on your keypad. The word algorithm buried in every app you use. The algebra hiding inside every piece of software ever written. None of these things belongs to any one city or any one civilization. They are relay races, run across thousands of years, from Babylon and Greece and India onward. But one of the great handoffs in that relay happened in 9th century Baghdad. And this chapter is about the men who made it. Beginning with a scholar whose name you have invoked thousands of times without knowing it. His name was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. He worked in Baghdad in the early 9th century, during the reign of al-Mamun. And he was, as far as the surviving sources tell us, a quiet man. No dramatic life story survives. No legends of court intrigue. Just books. But what books? Around the year 820, al-Khwarizmi wrote a treatise whose title contained the Arabic word al-Jabr, meaning roughly the restoring, or the completion. It offered a systematic method for solving equations, moving quantities from one side to the other, balancing, reducing, step by step, until the unknown revealed itself. Mathematicians in Babylon, Greece, and India had solved problems like these before him. What al-Khwarizmi did was gather that scattered inheritance into a clear, teachable system, a manual any educated person could follow. When his book was translated in medieval Europe, the word al-Jabr traveled with it. Say it a few times. Al-Jabr, algebra. The discipline it names grew far beyond him. But it still carries the title of a book written in Baghdad. And his own name went even further. In Latin, al-Khwarizmi became algorismi. And over the centuries, that word came to mean any step-by-step calculating procedure. Algorithm. The word that now describes what chooses your search results, your music, and the route your GPS picks this morning. A man's name, from this one city, quietly embedded in the vocabulary of the modern world. His most world-changing act, though, may have been something humbler. He wrote a book explaining, for readers in the Islamic world, a brilliant system of numbers developed in India. 9 digits and a small circle for 0, with the value of each digit depending on its position. It sounds obvious to us. It was revolutionary. Compare it to what most of Europe was using at the time. Roman numerals. Try multiplying 2 large numbers in Roman numerals sometime. There is a reason medieval European merchants needed counting boards just to do basic arithmetic. The Indian system made calculation something you could do with a pen. At speed. At any scale. Al-Khwarizmi's book helped spread it across the Islamic world. And centuries later, translations of that tradition carried it into Europe, where the digits became known as Arabic numerals. The full journey deserves to be said out loud. Invented in India, championed and taught to half the world through Baghdad, named by Europe after the messengers. Every price tag, every spreadsheet, every scoreboard on earth now runs on that journey. Al-Khwarizmi was not working alone. 9th century Baghdad was crowded with minds like his. There were the 3 Banu Musa brothers, wealthy patrons and engineers who wrote a famous book of ingenious devices, describing dozens of machines, trick fountains, automatic lamps, mechanisms using valves and floats that engineers today recognize as early feedback control. The same basic principle behind a modern thermostat. There was Al-Kindi, remembered as the first great philosopher of the Arab world, who wrote on everything from music theory to the nature of light, and who also produced one of the earliest known descriptions of frequency analysis, a method for breaking secret codes by counting how often each letter appears. Codebreakers used essentially that technique all the way into the 20th century. There was Thabit ibn Qurra, a brilliant mathematician from the star-worshipping community of Haran, welcomed in Baghdad for what his mind could do. who advanced geometry and number theory and helped translate the great Greek mathematicians. And then there was medicine. In the late 9th and early 10th century, the most famous physician in the city was Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, known to medieval Europe as Richest, a Persian doctor who directed hospital work in Baghdad. Al-Razi did something that sounds almost shockingly modern. He wrote a clinical description distinguishing smallpox from measles, based on careful observation of actual patients. A work so precise that it was still being printed for European medical students in the 18th century. Nearly 1,000 years on the syllabus. There is a popular story that when al-Razi was asked to choose the site for a new hospital, he hung pieces of meat in different quarters of the city and picked the spot where the meat rotted slowest, reasoning the air there was healthiest. The story appears in later sources and may well be embroidered. But notice what kind of legend this city told about its doctors. Not miracles. Experiments. That is the thread running through all of it. These scholars inherited the ancient books, and then they did the one thing that separates a living science from a dead library. They doubted. They measured. They corrected the ancients in writing, respectfully and sometimes not so respectfully. And the tradition they built kept producing giants long after them and far beyond this city. The greatest of the later masters of optics, Ibn al-Haytham, was born in Basra in southern Iraq and did his most celebrated work in Cairo, where he insisted that claims about light and vision must be tested by controlled experiment, a milestone historians of science still point to on the road to the modern experimental method. He was not a Baghdad scholar, and honesty makes us say so, but he grew inside the scientific world that Baghdad's translation movement had helped bring to life, reading the books it had gathered, answering the questions it had asked. Here is the editorial point, and it matters. A stubborn old myth says that between ancient Greece and the Renaissance, science simply went to sleep. You may have absorbed that story from 100 documentaries. The evidence in this chapter is a large part of the rebuttal. Science did not sleep. It kept moving, and for a few remarkable centuries. Much of its liveliest conversation happened in Arabic, and a striking share of that conversation ran through the city on the Tigris. But a city is more than its geniuses. Around those scholars lived hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, shopping, working, complaining about prices, raising children. What was it actually like to walk those streets at the height of the Golden Age? Let's spend a day there. Chapter 5. Life in the Golden City. Forget the caliphs for a moment. Forget the scholars. Imagine instead that you are an ordinary resident of Baghdad around the year 900. Somewhere in the vast city on the east bank of the Tigris. What does your day look like? The answer, assembled from chronicles, surviving handbooks, and the work of modern historians, is surprising in one particular way. Much of it feels familiar. You wake in a house built of brick, probably around a small courtyard, because the courtyard is the air conditioning of the medieval Middle East. Summer in Baghdad is brutal, regularly above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and the city adapted with architecture, thick walls, shaded courtyards. In the finer homes, the sources describe cool underground rooms for the worst afternoons, and there are accounts of ice, actual ice, brought down from the mountains and sold in the markets, so that a prosperous Baghdadi could drink chilled fruit syrup in the middle of a desert summer. That drink was called sharab, and if the word sounds faintly familiar, it should. It is the ancestor of the English words syrup and sherbet, both descended from the drinks of these markets. Then you step into the street, and you enter one of the great shopping cities of its age. The markets were organized by trade, street by street. Cloth merchants here, coppersmiths there, perfume sellers, leather workers, poultry dealers, each in their own lane, which made comparison shopping easy and cheating hard, because your competitor was standing 10 feet away. The 10th century geographers describe goods arriving from everywhere the known world touched. Silk and porcelain from China, spices from India, honey and furs and amber from the north, gold from Africa, olive oil from Spain. One writer of the era, al-Yaqubi, called Baghdad the crossroads of the universe, and claimed with unembarrassed civic pride that it had no equal on earth. Now here is a detail that tends to stop modern audiences. This city had hospitals, not simply sick rooms attached to shrines, but endowed institutions called bimaristans, which grew over the 9th and 10th centuries into some of the most organized medical charities of the medieval world. The sources describe salaried physicians, wards for different kinds of illness, and treatment funded by charitable endowments so that the poor could be cared for without payment. By the late 10th century, Baghdad's grandest hospital, the Adudi, founded in 982, reportedly kept some 24 physicians on staff, and medical students learned at the bedside alongside their teachers. Historians rightly caution against painting these institutions as modern hospitals in medieval dress, and details differ from source to source and decade to decade. But the honest conclusion still lands with force. Baghdad offered a level of organized urban medical care that was unusual anywhere in the world of that time, and it treated the healing of strangers as a public duty rather than a private luck. Your children, if you could afford modest fees, might attend school at the local mosque, learning to read and write. Literacy rates are impossible to measure at this distance, but historians agree book culture ran unusually deep here. This was a city where a professional class of copyists made a living reproducing texts, where bookshops clustered by the hundreds in the stationer's market, and where the biographical dictionaries of the era, essentially the who's who volumes of medieval Islam, record scholars, copyists, and booksellers as notable citizens worth remembering. A city that puts booksellers in its hall of fame is telling you what it worships. Evenings belonged to pleasure, and Baghdad took pleasure seriously. The wealthy hosted salons where poets competed and singers performed. Chess players gathered, because chess, an import from India by way of Persia, was the intellectual craze of the age, and the caliphs kept celebrity champions at court. Ordinary people had the storytellers, professional entertainers performing in streets, markets, and gatherings, spinning tales of clever thieves, tragic lovers, and sailors like Sinbad. Many of those tales would later flow into the collection the world knows as the 1001 Nights. And the cooking. The oldest surviving Arabic cookbook was compiled in 10th century Baghdad by a writer named Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq, and it contains hundreds of recipes, from slow-cooked stews to almond pastries perfumed with rosewater. People sometimes ask what the Golden Age tasted like. The honest answer is, we still have the recipes. Was it paradise? No. Let's be honest about that too. This same city had desperate slums along the canals. It had slavery, woven deep into the economy and the household. It had mob violence, plague years, and price riots when the grain fleets ran late. The chronicles record all of it. Baghdad, at its height, was not a utopia. It was something more believable and in some ways more impressive. A real, functioning, enormous city, running at a level of sophistication that travelers from most of the world would have found astonishing. And that is exactly why what happens next in our story carries such weight. Because none of the people in this chapter, the ice sellers, the librarians, The hospital physicians, the storytellers, could see what the historians can see now. Looking back, the money beneath their golden city was quietly running short. The soldiers guarding it were quietly becoming its masters. The empire that fed it was coming apart at the seams, so slowly that each generation could tell itself nothing had really changed. Chapter 6. The Slow Unraveling. Here is a question historians love to argue about. When did the Golden Age of Baghdad end? Some point to a year, some point to a battle, but the honest answer is more unsettling. Great cities almost never die from a single blow. They erode, decision by decision, decade by decade, while the people living inside them keep insisting everything is fine. Baghdad's unraveling took 3 centuries, and it teaches a lesson every empire since has had to learn the hard way. The most dangerous enemies are rarely at the gates. They are on the payroll. The trouble began, strangely enough, with a security upgrade. In the early 9th century, the caliphs started building an army of enslaved and imported soldiers, mostly Turkish horsemen from the Central Asian steppe. Men with no tribal ties inside the empire, loyal only to the ruler who paid them. On paper, it was brilliant. Professional soldiers, superb cavalry, no messy local politics. In practice, the caliphs had created a force that answered to no one but its own commanders. The new troops clashed so badly with the people of Baghdad that in 836, the caliph moved the entire capital north to a new city called Samarra. Partly, the chroniclers tell us, to keep his own army away from his own citizens. Sit with that sentence for a moment. The ruler of one of the richest empires on earth built a new capital to escape his own bodyguards. It did not work. In Samarra, the guards discovered exactly how much power they held. In 861, Turkish officers murdered the Caliph al-Mutawakkil in his own palace. Then came a decade so chaotic that historians call it the anarchy at Samarra. 4 caliphs in roughly 10 years, made and unmade by soldiers demanding pay. The caliphate never truly recovered its authority. The capital eventually moved back to Baghdad. But something invisible had broken. Everyone in the empire had now seen the truth. The commander of the faithful could be killed by his own guards, and the sky would not fall. Once that spell broke, the empire began to peel apart like paint. Governors in distant provinces stopped sending taxes and started founding dynasties. Egypt went its own way. Persia fractured into regional kingdoms, and with every lost province, the money shrank. And with less money, the soldiers grew angrier, and angry unpaid soldiers made the politics worse, which lost more provinces. It was a doom loop, running in slow motion, for 100 years. Then came the humiliation that made it official. In 945, a Persian dynasty called the Buyids marched into Baghdad itself. They did not abolish the caliph. They did something colder. They kept him as a kind of sacred figurehead, stripped of real power, useful for blessing whoever actually ruled. For the next 3 centuries, with brief exceptions, that was the caliph's job. In 1055, the Buyids were replaced by the Seljuk Turks. New masters. Same arrangement. Imagine the Pope and the Emperor compressed into one office. And then imagine that office reduced to signing documents someone else wrote. That was the caliphate now, and the city suffered with it. This period saw Baghdad torn by something poisonous. Repeated street warfare between Sunni and Shia neighborhoods, with quarters burned and mobs answering mobs, flaring up decade after decade. The chroniclers of the era record these fires with weary regularity. At the same time, the physical machinery of Mesopotamia was failing. the canal system that fed the city, the inheritance of thousands of years of irrigation, needed constant, expensive maintenance. Weak governments deferred it. Floods from the Tigris smashed neighborhoods and were only partly repaired. Historians studying the region describe canals silting up and farmland shrinking through the 11th and 12th centuries. A slow decay with many causes: neglect, flood, war, and shifting rivers among them. Baghdad was still a great city, but it was living off its capital, in every sense of the word. Here is what makes this period genuinely strange. Though the lights of the mind stayed on, even as the politics rotted, Baghdad, in the 11th and 12th centuries, built some of the most influential colleges of the medieval world. The Nizamiya, founded in 1067, where the famous theologian al-Ghazali taught, and later the magnificent Mustansiriya, whose building still stands beside the Tigris today. Scholars kept writing. The bookshops stayed open. It is one of history's recurring ironies. A civilization's culture often burns brightest in the long twilight, after its power is already gone. By the early 13th century, the caliphs had even clawed back some independence, ruling a modest state around Baghdad, while the great powers around them fought each other. A visitor in the year 1250 might have said the worst was over. The city had survived the soldiers, the schisms, the floods, and 3 centuries of decline. It was smaller, poorer, and shakier than in the days of Harun al-Rashid, but it was still Baghdad, still the city of the caliphs, still standing after 500 years. That visitor could not have known what was already moving in the east, along the very road that ran out through the Khorasan Gate, a power unlike anything in the city's experience, an army that did not want to control the caliph, or tax the caliph, or rule through the caliph, an army that had conquered half the known world, and whose commander had a very specific question for Baghdad: submit, or die. Chapter 7, 1258. The year. The river ran black. Every city has a date it cannot escape. For Rome, it is the sack of 410. For Constantinople, 1453. For Baghdad, it is 1258. A date that still functions across the Middle East as shorthand for civilizational catastrophe. 7.5 centuries after the fact, this chapter is the hardest one in our story. It should be. First, understand what was coming. The Mongol Empire of the mid-13th century was the largest land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe. In the 1250s, the great Khan Mongol ordered his brother Hulagu westward with an enormous army and a clear mission: bring the remaining powers of the Islamic world to heel. Estimates of the army's size vary, but historians describe one of the largest Mongol forces ever assembled. Gathering troops, Chinese siege engineers, and allied contingents as it moved. This was not a raid. It was a demolition program, and it worked through the map methodically. In 1256, Hulagu destroyed the assassins of Alamut, the fortress sect that had terrorized the region for over a century and a half. Then he turned toward Baghdad, and his message traveled ahead of him, down the Khorasan road, through the eastern gate that al-Mansur's builders had named 500 years before. The road to the empire had become the road from it. The caliph was al-Mustasim, the 37th Abbasid. We should note that his memory comes to us largely through chroniclers writing after his fall, many of them hostile. So the portrait deserves a grain of caution. But the portrait they paint is consistent. A pleasant, indecisive man, catastrophically overconfident. Hulagu's demand was simple: dismantle your walls, acknowledge Mongol authority, and submit. Al-Mustasim's advisors split. Some urged accommodation. Others assured him Baghdad was untouchable, that the Islamic world would rise to defend the city of the caliphs. Al-Mustasim chose defiance, sent back a proud refusal. And then, and this is the detail that damns him in the sources, did almost nothing to prepare. He did not seriously reinforce the walls. He did not summon distant help in time. Some accounts even report he had cut the army's payrolls in the years before. He behaved as if 500 years of prestige were themselves a fortress. In January of 1258, the Mongol army arrived and surrounded the city. What remained of the caliph's field army had already been shattered in the marshes outside, where Mongol commanders reportedly broke river dikes and drowned or trapped much of the force. The siege itself was shockingly brief. Chinese engineers assembled batteries of siege machines and pounded the walls. Within about 2 weeks, a tower was crumbling, and Mongol troops were on the ramparts. On February 10th, 1258, the Caliph came out and surrendered. The gates opened, and then Baghdad, the city of peace, endured roughly a week of organized destruction that the region has never forgotten. What happened inside is documented by multiple traditions. Persian historians who worked for the Mongols themselves, Arabic chroniclers, and later travelers, and they agree on the essentials. The population was put to the sword in enormous numbers. The palaces were stripped, great mosques burned, and the world of books suffered a wound that became the event's enduring symbol. Later accounts claim the Tigris ran black with the ink of books thrown into the water, and some add that it afterward ran red. Modern historians read that image carefully, and many treat it partly as a literary emblem, a way for grieving writers to say what plain words could not. The details behind it are genuinely hard to reconstruct at this distance. Which libraries were destroyed? How many books were lost? What still remained of the old House of Wisdom collections by 1258? The sources do not let us answer with confidence. And we know some collections survived or were carried off to the new Mongol observatory at Maraga. So let's say it the honest way. The Black River belongs partly to legend. The devastation of Baghdad does not. Libraries and collections undoubtedly suffered grievously in a week when much of the city was burned and emptied, and the age in which Baghdad stood at the center of the world's learning ended. Visibly and permanently. That winter, how many people died? Here we must be careful, because the sources disagree wildly. Contemporary and later accounts give figures ranging from 90,000 up to hundreds of thousands, and one later claim even reached 2 million, a number almost no modern historian accepts. Hulagu himself, in a surviving letter, is reported to have claimed 200,000. The honest summary is this: we will never know the true count. But even cautious modern readings describe one of the deadliest sacks of any city in the medieval world, with victims certainly in the tens of thousands and very possibly far beyond. As for the Caliph, Mongol custom forbade spilling royal blood on the ground. So, according to the most widely repeated account, recorded by several sources, Al-Mustasim was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. The 37th commander of the faithful, heir to al-Mansur, who drew the round city, to Harun al-Rashid, who exchanged embassies with Charlemagne, to al-Mamun, who collected Greek manuscripts by the chest, died under hooves in the ruins of his capital. The Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad, after 496 years, was over. A famous story adds that Hulagu first locked the Caliph in his treasury and invited him to eat his gold. That scene appears in accounts hostile to the Caliph and may be a moral fable rather than fact. But it captures how even the Muslim chroniclers judged al-Mustasim, a man who hoarded treasure and lost a civilization's capital. Step back now, because the meaning of 1258 is bigger than one city's tragedy, and also easier to overstate than you might think. For 5 centuries, Baghdad had been a reference point for an entire civilization. That civilization did not die in 1258, and we should be precise about this. Learning continued and flourished in Cairo, in Damascus, in Muslim Spain, in Persia and India. And modern historians push back hard on the old claim that the Mongols single-handedly ended the Islamic Golden Age. But something irreplaceable did end here. The city itself lost its place at the center, and the countryside around it. That ancient, irrigated world which had made a giant city possible, absorbed a blow it could not afford. The conquest intensified damage to an irrigation system already weakened by centuries of neglect, flooding, conflict, and shrinking population. And much of rural Mesopotamia never returned to its old abundance in the centuries that followed. Baghdad did not die in 1258. People crept back. Markets reopened. Prayers resumed. But the giant was gone. And what remained was a town living inside the ruins of a legend. At the start of 6 long centuries in the shadows, those centuries have their own quiet story, and even their own visitors. And one of the greatest travelers who ever lived is about to walk through the gates and tell us what he saw. Chapter 8. The Centuries in the Shadows. What happens to a city after the worst week in its history? Hollywood would tell you one of 2 stories. Either the city rises heroically from the ashes, or it vanishes into the sand like Babylon. Baghdad did neither. It survived, but small. It became a working provincial town wearing the name of a legend, and it stayed that way for some 600 years. Historians sometimes skip these centuries in a paragraph. We will not, partly because they shaped the modern city, and partly because the idea that nothing happened here is itself a myth worth correcting. Life went on, trade went on, scholarship went on. What ended was Baghdad's place at the center of the world's attention. And there is a difference between a city that is asleep and a city that the world has simply stopped watching. Start with the twist that almost no one expects. The Mongols, who destroyed Baghdad, became its rulers. And within a few generations, they converted. Hulagu's dynasty, known as the Ilkhans, governed Iraq and Persia from their courts in the north. And in 1295, the Ilkhan Ghazan formally embraced Islam. The grandsons of the men who trampled the caliph into the dirt were now praying in the faith of the city they had broken. Under the Ilkhans, parts of Baghdad were rebuilt. Markets and colleges reopened. And the Mustansiriya school we met earlier went on teaching. But the capital had moved elsewhere. And the tax records of the era, studied closely by modern historians, show Iraq's revenues collapsing to a fraction of their old levels. Baghdad was alive. It was simply no longer the sun of anyone's solar system. We have an eyewitness for this era, and he is one of the most remarkable men of the entire Middle Ages. In 1327, the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta walked into Baghdad. He was in the early years of a journey that would eventually cover, by his own account, most of the known world, from West Africa to China. A career so vast that he is often compared to Marco Polo and travelled considerably farther. His book describes the Baghdad he found. He admired its bathhouses, its bridges of boats, its congregational mosques, and its teaching colleges, and he recorded, without needing to editorialize, what mattered most. Nearly 70 years after Hulagu, the city was functioning. Pilgrims and merchants moved through it. Scholars still taught in it. Ibn Battuta even traveled for a time with the camp of the last great Ilkhan ruler, Abu Sa'id. whom he met in the city itself. But his pages carry an unmistakable undertone. He describes a great western half of Baghdad largely in ruin, and a city visibly smaller than its fame promised. He had seen Cairo. He knew what an imperial metropolis looked like in his own century. Baghdad was no longer it. And then, just as the wounds were scarring over, history struck the same bruise again. In 1401, a new conqueror arrived from Central Asia. His name was Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, a military genius who modelled himself on the Mongols and, by the accounts of his own court historians, matched them in theatrical cruelty. Baghdad resisted him, and when the city fell in the summer heat, Timur ordered his soldiers to bring him proof of killing. The chroniclers of his reign describe towers built from the skulls of the slain, and they give death tolls in the tens of thousands, with some accounts claiming 90,000. As always with medieval numbers, treat the exact figures with caution. What is not in doubt is the result. A city still recovering from 1258 was massacred a second time. 143 years later, there are cities in history that were unlucky. Baghdad was struck by two of the most destructive conquerors who ever lived, and it was struck by both within 7 generations. After Timur, Baghdad passed through 2 centuries as a prize contested by powers most people outside the region have never heard of. Turkmen, confederations with memorable names, the Black Sheep and the White Sheep, who traded the city back and forth. Then, in the early 1500s, the contest sharpened into something larger and far more lasting. 2 new superpowers rose on either side of Iraq. To the east, the Safavid Empire of Persia, which made Shia Islam its state faith. To the west, the Ottoman Empire of the Turks, champions of Sunni Islam. Fresh from conquering Constantinople, Baghdad sat exactly on the fault line between them, geographically, politically, and religiously. The Safavids took the city in 1508. The Ottomans seized it in 1534. The Safavids stormed back in 1623, and in 1638, after a massive siege, the Ottoman Sultan Murad IV took Baghdad for the final time. A conquest so celebrated in Istanbul that a pavilion in the Topkapi Palace still bears Baghdad's name. Notice what Baghdad had become in that story. Not the prize of the world. A border fortress. The city that once received embassies and elephants was now valued mainly for its walls and its position. A peace pushed back and forth between 2 empires, and each conquest came with sectarian score settling. Sunni and Shia communities suffering in turn as the flags changed, deepening a divide that, as we will see, still runs through Iraqi politics today. Here is the pattern worth carrying forward from these centuries. Baghdad's location made it rich when the world was connected through it, and made it a battlefield when the world divided across it. Geography gave, and geography took away. Yet, through all of it, the name never lost its power. Across the Islamic world, Baghdad remained shorthand for learning and glory, the way Rome remained shorthand for empire in Europe long after the legions were gone. Pilgrims still came to the tombs of its saints and scholars. Poets in Istanbul, Isfahan, and Delhi still wrote of the city of peace. A reputation, it turns out, can outlive the thing that earned it by centuries. And Baghdad's reputation was about to spend 400 years waiting for the city to catch back up to it. The empire that would preside over most of that long wait had just raised its flag over the walls. And under that flag, in ways nobody expected, the modern world would come creeping up the rivers. Chapter 9. An Ottoman Outpost. For nearly 300 years after 1638, Baghdad lived under the Ottoman flag. 3 centuries under one empire sounds stable, even sleepy. The reality on the ground was anything but. This chapter is the story of a diminished but stubborn city, and of the slow process by which steam, telegraph wires, and the appetites of distant powers shook it awake. First, the honest picture of Ottoman Baghdad at its hardest moments. The city's population rose and fell with disaster, sometimes reaching perhaps 100,000 people by travelers' estimates, sometimes falling far below. European visitors began passing through in these centuries and writing down what they saw, and their reports are quietly heartbreaking. The Italian traveller Pietro della Valle, who visited in the early 1600s, found a modest walled town living amid visible ruins. And like other visitors of his era, he struggled to reconcile it with the Baghdad of the storybooks. A legend had even taken hold among some travelers that this shrunken place could not possibly be the real Baghdad, that the true Golden City must lie buried somewhere else. It was a reasonable mistake. The city of the House of Wisdom now had roughly the population of a single modern college town. Disaster kept a schedule. Plague swept the city repeatedly, and the outbreak of 1831 was apocalyptic. That year, according to accounts from the period, bubonic plague tore through the population, and while it raged, the Tigris flooded and broke into the city, collapsing homes by the thousand. Contemporary reports describe Baghdad losing an enormous share of its people within months, with some estimates claiming a third or even half. Treat the precise fractions cautiously. As always, the consensus remains grim. 1831 hollowed the city out, and famine and cholera returned in later decades. Nature, it seemed, had joined the long list of Baghdad's conquerors. Politically, Istanbul's grip was often loose to the point of fiction. Through much of the 1700s, Baghdad was actually run by a self-perpetuating line of Mamluks, elite slave soldiers of mostly Georgian origin, who governed in the Sultan's name while ignoring him whenever convenient. It sounds bizarre to modern ears. Enslaved men rising to rule a province. But listen to the echo. It is the old Abbasid pattern from chapter 6. Soldiers imported for their loyalty, who ended up holding the power they were hired to guard. Baghdad kept reliving its own history. Only in 1831, the same terrible year as the plague, did an Ottoman army retake direct control of the city. And it would be wrong and unfair to the Baghdadis of these centuries to paint their whole world as ruin and waiting. The caravan trade still moved. The coffee houses, which had spread through the Ottoman world by the late 1500s, filled with talk and storytellers. The shrines of the city drew pilgrims from as far as India. Religious scholarship continued in the mosques and colleges, and the city remained a center of learning for the region, even in its reduced state. Ordinary Baghdad was not asleep. It was simply living at a scale history books rarely bother to record, and its people would have been surprised to hear later generations describe their whole era as an intermission. Then, in the second half of the 1800s, something new stirred, and much of it came by water. British steamboats began working the Tigris in the 1830s and 40s, cutting travel times that had been fixed since the Middle Ages. The telegraph reached Baghdad in the 1860s, plugging the old city into a wire that ran, through relays, all the way to London and India, and under an energetic Ottoman governor named Midhat Pasha, who ruled from 1869 to 1872. Baghdad received a burst of forced modernization. A newspaper, new schools, a tramway, land reform, even the demolition of the crumbling medieval walls to let the city breathe. Midhat stayed only 3 years, and many projects stalled after him. But the direction was set. The city was beginning, hesitantly, to face forward again. Why were the British so interested in this faraway river town? Look at the map through London's eyes. Iraq sat squarely on the short route to India, the centerpiece of the British Empire. Steamers, mail, telegraph lines, all of it wanted to pass this way. By the late 1800s, Germany had noticed too, and won Ottoman agreement for a grand railway project meant to link Berlin to Baghdad and onward toward the Gulf. A scheme that made strategists in London genuinely nervous. The great powers of Europe were beginning to circle Mesopotamia, decades before most Europeans could have found it on a map without help. And there was the whisper beneath the ground. For thousands of years, travelers in this region had described eternal fires and black seepage oozing from the earth, bitumen that ancient builders had used as mortar. By the early 1900s, that curiosity had a modern name, petroleum, and a new importance, because the navies of the world were converting from coal to oil. In 1908, oil was struck in commercial quantities just across the border in Persia. In 1912, European and Ottoman interests formed a company aimed at the oil of Mesopotamia itself, with the Baghdad and Mosul regions squarely in its sights. No great field had yet been drilled in Iraq, but the paperwork of the 20th century's obsession was already being signed. Almost no one in the markets of Baghdad knew it, but the ground under their feet had quietly become some of the most strategically interesting real estate on the planet. So picture Baghdad in the summer of 1914, a city of perhaps 140,000 people by common estimates. Minarets and mud brick, riverboats, and a few new workshops. A place still poor, still provincial, but stirring. Its people were subjects of a sultan in Istanbul, more than 1,000 miles away. And the quarrels of Europe were somebody else's problem, far beyond the horizon. Then, in August of 1914, the powers of Europe declared war on each other. Within months, the Ottoman Empire joined Germany and Britain, guarding the route to India and newly hungry for oil security. Landed troops at the head of the Gulf, at Basra, downriver from Baghdad. The armies of the industrial age were now on the Tigris, moving upstream, toward a city that had not stood at the center of the world's attention in 650 years. It was about to stand there again, and it would pay heavily for the privilege. Chapter 10. The British and the Birth of Iraq. On March 11th, 1917, British troops marched into Baghdad, and for the first time since Hulagu the Mongol, the city changed hands to a power from outside the Islamic world. A week later, the British commander, General Stanley Maude, issued a proclamation that has been quoted with bitter irony ever since. Our armies, it declared, do not come into your cities and lands as conquerors, but as liberators. Keep that sentence in mind. This chapter is the story of what it turned out to mean, and modern Iraq is still living inside the answer. First, the war itself, because the British path to Baghdad was anything but glorious. The campaign up the rivers from Basra had produced one of Britain's worst humiliations of the entire First World War. The Siege of Kut, where in 1916 a trapped British and Indian army surrendered after months of starvation, with thousands of the prisoners dying afterward on brutal marches into captivity. London answered the embarrassment with overwhelming force, rebuilt the army, and took Baghdad the following spring. The Ottoman flag came down after nearly 400 years in the region. Many Baghdadis genuinely celebrated. Late Ottoman rule had ended in conscription, hangings, and hunger, and hope was in the air. Hope, and a question. If not the Sultan, then who? Parts of the answer had had been sketched in Europe while the war still raged. In 1916, British and French diplomats had quietly drawn up an understanding for dividing Ottoman lands into spheres of influence. An arrangement remembered as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, named for its two negotiators. The agreement did not draw Iraq's actual borders, and the final map of the region emerged only later, through conferences, treaties, and years of horse trading. But Sykes-Picot became the lasting symbol of the whole process, because it captured its essence. The future of these lands was being negotiated by distant officials, with local peoples largely uninformed and unconsulted. When the war ended, the new League of Nations wrapped the outcome in respectable language. Iraq would not be a colony. Officially, it would be a mandate, a territory administered by Britain until it was judged ready to govern itself. To many Iraqis, the distinction was invisible. A foreign flag is a foreign flag. The new Iraq brought together the former Ottoman provinces of Mosul in the north, Baghdad in the center, and Basra in the south. Roughly speaking, and every simplification here is rough, the north held a large Kurdish population, the center a Sunni Arab plurality, the south a Shia Arab majority, with Jews, Christians, Turkmen, Yazidis, and others woven through all three. It has become fashionable to describe the result as a purely artificial country. Three strangers stapled together in London. Historians of Iraq push back on that story, and they are right to. These regions had traded with each other, intermarried, studied in each other's schools, and looked to Baghdad as their metropolis for centuries. And currents of shared Iraqi identity were stirring before the British ever arrived. The state was new. The relationships among its regions and communities were not. What the mandate did do was decide. From above, and in a hurry, the borders, the institutions, and crucially, the distribution of power within that new state. And several of those decisions planted resentments that would compound for generations. The tremors from that founding run through the rest of our story. Iraqis did not accept the arrangement quietly. In 1920, a massive revolt spread through the country, uniting, for a moment, Sunni and Shia tribes against British rule. The British crushed it, at heavy cost to both sides, using aircraft against tribal areas, a tactic that shocked even some observers in Britain. The revolt failed, but it taught London that direct rule was unaffordable. Britain needed a cheaper solution, an Arab government friendly to British interests. It needed a king. The search for one brought together an unusual cast, and its most famous member was an Englishwoman named Gertrude Bell, archaeologist, mountaineer, desert traveler, fluent in Arabic and Persian. She had spent decades crossing the Middle East and knew its tribal politics better than almost any European alive. As a senior official in the British administration in Baghdad, working alongside the civil commissioner, Percy Cox, and within decisions steered from London and the Cairo Conference of 1921, she helped select and promote the candidate for the new throne. Her letters, which survive and are quoted in every biography, show her both exhilarated and uneasy at the work of shaping a country from an office. She was one influential figure inside an imperial machine, not the machine itself. But few individuals left more fingerprints on the founding of modern Iraq. The chosen king was Faisal, son of the ruler of Mecca, a leader of the wartime Arab revolt against the Ottomans, a man of genuine stature, and a man who had never lived in Iraq. In August of 1921, after a plebiscite whose reported 96% approval is viewed skeptically by historians, Faisal the first was crowned in Baghdad while a band, having no Iraqi anthem yet to play, struck up "God Save the King." Bel herself founded the Iraq Museum, gathering the antiquities of Mesopotamia into the capital. She died in Baghdad in 1926 and is buried there still. Give Faisal his due. He was no puppet by temperament, and he spent his reign maneuvering, skillfully and often thanklessly, between British demands and Iraqi expectations. Schools opened. A parliament assembled. In 1932, Iraq formally became independent and joined the League of Nations, the first mandate to graduate. On paper, the experiment had worked. Underneath, two hard truths remained. British influence continued, secured by treaty, military bases, and above all oil. For in 1927, drillers had struck a gusher near Kirkuk, and the fields were controlled by a foreign-owned company on terms that would feed Iraqi resentment for decades. And the state itself still lacked a settled national compact, a worry that a famous memorandum attributed to Faisal's final years laments in strikingly blunt terms. Faisal died in 1933, exhausted, at 48, and the throne passed to less careful hands. What followed was a preview of the century ahead. In 1936, Baghdad hosted the first military coup in the modern Arab world, and coups quickly became a habit of the state. In 1941, a pro-German government seized power in the middle of the Second World War, and Britain invaded again to reverse it. In the lawless days that followed the fighting, Baghdad's ancient Jewish community suffered a devastating pogrom known as the Farhud, in which between roughly 150 and 180 Jews were murdered, according to widely cited estimates, with hundreds more injured and homes and shops plundered. The wound never fully healed. Within roughly a decade of Israel's founding and the upheavals that followed, a community that had lived on these rivers for some 2,500 years, since the days of Babylon, departed almost entirely. Whatever else the 20th century gave Baghdad, it took away one of the city's oldest threads, and an honest history has to say so. By the 1950s, oil money was finally flowing into development. New bridges, new districts, ambitious plans commissioned from world-famous architects. Baghdad was growing fast, filling with migrants from the countryside, buzzing with radios that carried a new sound. The fiery nationalism of Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, preaching that the age of kings and empires was over. In the officers' clubs of the Iraqi army, young men were listening very closely. On July 14th, 1958, before dawn, army units rolled into Baghdad. By breakfast, the monarchy that Britain had assembled was gone, and the royal family lay dead in a palace courtyard. The Republic of Iraq had arrived, and it arrived shooting. Chapter 11. Revolution, Oil, and the Rise of Saddam. There is a pattern in Baghdad's modern history so consistent it reads like a curse. Each new regime is born, promising to end the violence of the last one, and each ends in violence of its own. The Republic, born on July 14th, 1958, announced itself with the killing of the royal family, including the young King Faisal II. And within hours, Baghdad crowds were dragging the body of the longtime strongman prime minister through the streets. Foreign correspondents in the city that week described jubilation and horror side by side. It was year zero, and everything felt possible, including the worst. The coup's leader, General Abd al-Karim Qasim, ruled for less than 5 years, and they were crowded years. He pulled Iraq out of its Western alliances, bought weapons from the Soviet Union, passed land reform, built housing for the poor of Baghdad, and created a vast public district for rural migrants that would one day be known as Sada City. Keep that name nearby. It returns in our story. Qasim also survived an assassination attempt in 1959. Machine-gunned in his car on a Baghdad street. Among the young gunmen who fled wounded into exile that day was a 22-year-old from the town of Tikrit named Saddam Hussein. History had just introduced, almost in passing, one of the central figures of Iraq's coming half-century. In February 1963, Qasim's turn came, a coup led partly by the Ba'ath Party, a movement preaching Arab unity and socialism, captured him after street fighting and shot him after a trial that reportedly lasted minutes, to kill the rumors that he lived. His body was shown on Iraqi television. The new rulers then turned on suspected communists in a wave of killings and torture that Baghdadis remembered with dread for a generation. The Baathists were pushed out within months. Army officers ruled for 5 more years. And in 1968, the Ba'ath came back. This time methodically. This time to stay. The face of the new regime was President Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr. Its spine, increasingly, was his younger kinsman from Tikrit, the same Saddam Hussein, now in charge of internal security. Through the 1970s, Saddam built the machinery quietly. Party cells in every neighborhood, overlapping intelligence services, informers in schools and offices, key posts filled with relatives and men from Tikrit. Iraqis learned to speak carefully, then to whisper, then to teach their children which jokes could destroy a family. And yet, and this is the paradox worth holding honestly, the 1970s were also, by wide agreement, Baghdad's brightest modern decade. In 1972, Iraq nationalized its oil. And after the global price shock of 1973, money fell from the sky. Oil revenues multiplied many times over within a few years. And the state spent universities, hospitals, freeways, hotels, art galleries, theaters, literacy campaigns sent teachers into villages, and international organizations praised the effort. Electricity reached the countryside. Women entered universities and professions at rates that led the region. Visitors in that decade described a confident, cosmopolitan capital, and many older Iraqis, whatever they think of the politics, still speak of the 70s with aching nostalgia. Authoritarian states can build impressive things while the money lasts. Baghdad, in 1979, was the proof. A golden cage at the height of its shine. That year, the cage snapped shut completely. In July 1979, al-Bakr resigned, officially for health reasons, and Saddam took the presidency. Within days, he staged a scene that tells you everything about the decades to come. At a filmed party assembly, names of alleged conspirators were read aloud while Saddam sat watching, and the accused were led from the hall one by one as their colleagues, sweating, began to applaud and swear loyalty. Senior party members were executed, with surviving officials reportedly forced to join the firing squads, binding them in blood. The footage exists because he wanted it to exist. Fear was the message, and the message was received. Barely a year later, Saddam made the gambler's throw that broke the golden decade. Next door, Iran's revolution had just replaced the Shah with a hostile clerical government, and its army looked shattered. In September 1980, Saddam invaded, expecting a short victorious war and regional leadership. He got 8 years of the 20th century at its most pitiless. The Iran-Iraq War became a rerun of the First World War with modern weapons. Trenches, human wave assaults, poison, gas, missiles falling on Baghdad and Tehran during the so-called War of the Cities. when it finally ended in 1988, with borders essentially unchanged. Credible estimates put the dead on both sides in the hundreds of thousands, with some estimates ranging higher still. In the same period, Saddam's forces turned on Iraq's own Kurdish population in the campaign known as Anfal, killing tens of thousands by conservative counts, including the poison gas massacre at Halabja in 1988. Atrocities later formally recognized by several governments and courts as genocide. Say this plainly. Without politics, these are among the great crimes of the late 20th century, and the government seated in Baghdad committed them. Iraq came out of the war broke, owing tens of billions, its oil income mortgaged to war debts. Saddam looked south at small, wealthy Kuwait, quarreled over money and oil, and in August 1990, invaded and annexed it. This time the world answered. An American-led coalition of dozens of nations massed in the desert. And, in January 1991, Operation Desert Storm opened with weeks of bombing that reached deep into Baghdad itself, shattering bridges, power stations, and ministries. The ground war expelled Iraq from Kuwait in about 100 hours. Uprisings then erupted across Iraq's north and south, and were crushed by the regime's remaining forces with terrible bloodshed, while the world largely watched from a distance. Saddam survived. Iraqis paid. Through the 1990s, the country lived under the most comprehensive economic sanctions of the modern era, imposed to disarm the regime. The regime stayed. The middle class collapsed instead. Professors sold their personal libraries on the sidewalks of Al-Mutanabi Street to buy food. The currency crumbled. Salaries became jokes. Child malnutrition and preventable disease climbed. And researchers still argue over the full human toll of that decade, with estimates that vary widely and remain politically charged. What no one disputes is what Baghdadis could see with their own eyes. A city that had boasted some of the region's best hospitals now begged for medicine. A generation grew up knowing the outside world mainly as the source of bombs and embargoes. By the year 2000, Baghdad was a tired, isolated capital, ruled by fear, decorated with the statues and murals of one man, waiting. Its people had endured a monarchy, repeated coups and coup attempts, multiple wars, and a siege economy, all within living memory. Surely, many told themselves, the worst had already happened. Then came September 11th, 2001, an attack on America planned elsewhere, carried out by others, but in Washington, eyes turned toward Baghdad all the same, and the round city's name began appearing in speeches an ocean away. The bombs were coming back, and this time the whole world would watch them fall live. Chapter 12, 2003. The bombs return. In the early hours of March 20th, 2003, air raid sirens sounded over Baghdad, and missiles began falling on the city of Al-Mansur for the second time in 12 years. But this time was different, and everyone knew it. This time the armies were not stopping at the border. They were coming for the capital itself, something no foreign force had attempted since the British in 1917. This chapter must be told carefully, because it is recent. It is painful, and honest people still disagree about it fiercely. So we will do what this whole story has tried to do. Stick to what is documented. Name the disputes as disputes, and let the weight of events speak. First, how it came to this. After September 11th, the American administration of President George W. Bush declared a global war on terror, and its attention settled on Iraq. The public case rested on two main claims: that Saddam's regime held weapons of mass destruction in violation of United Nations resolutions, and that it posed a danger that could no longer be tolerated. United Nations inspectors returned to Iraq in late 2002, reported finding no stockpiles in their months of searching before the war, and asked for more time. The United States and Britain argued that waiting was too risky. France, Germany, and Russia opposed the invasion. The Security Council did not pass a new resolution explicitly authorizing it, and the war's legality remains argued over by governments and scholars to this day. In February 2003, millions marched against the coming war in cities around the world. Some of the largest coordinated protests ever recorded. The invasion proceeded anyway, led by the United States and Britain with allied contingents. And on the central public claim, the record is now as settled as such records get, and it deserves to be stated carefully and plainly. After the invasion, the inspection effort, organized by the coalition itself, searched the country and found no active stockpiles of the kind invoked to justify the war. And the official American investigation concluded that Iraq's major prohibited weapons programs had largely ended years earlier. Whatever one believes about motives, the war's central stated premise did not survive contact with the evidence. That is not opinion. It is the finding of the investigators sent by the governments that fought the war. The military campaign itself was fast, faster than almost anyone predicted. The world watched it live. Night vision, green skies over Baghdad, correspondents broadcasting from hotel balconies as the explosions rolled through government districts. The strategy even had a television-ready name: shock and awe. Within 3 weeks, American armored columns were conducting raids into the heart of the capital. The Iraqi army, hollowed by sanctions and fear, largely dissolved rather than fight to the end. And on April 9th, 2003, in Firdos Square in central Baghdad, a crowd and an American armored vehicle together pulled down a giant statue of Saddam Hussein, the loop of steel cable around its neck, the body pitching forward and snapping at the knees. The image circled the planet within minutes as the symbol of the regime's end. Later reporting established that the crowd in the square was fairly small and that American troops initiated much of the toppling. A reminder, worth flagging in any honest documentary, that iconic images are also constructed images. Saddam himself fled, was captured in a hole near Tikrit that December, tried by an Iraqi court, and hanged in December 2006. The regime of fear was gone, and for that, many Iraqis genuinely rejoiced. Mass graves of its victims were opened across the country that summer, and families walked the trenches, carrying photographs. Nothing in this chapter erases what the dictatorship was. But what came next in Baghdad turned triumph toward tragedy, with a speed that still stuns historians of the war. Because when the government fell, the state fell with it, and nobody filled the space. In the days after April 9th, Baghdad was swept by looting on a scale rarely seen in any modern capital. Ministries were stripped to the wiring. Hospitals lost equipment. And then came the losses. This story feels most personally the Iraq Museum, the great collection founded in Gertrude Bell's day, holding treasures of Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria, was looted, with roughly 15,000 objects taken by common estimates, some later recovered, many still missing. The National Library and Archive burned, destroying irreplaceable Ottoman-era documents and rare books. Scholars and heritage organizations had warned before the war of exactly this danger. The protection that arrived was too little and too late, and the failure has been defended, criticized, and mourned in sharply different terms ever since, by officials and archaeologists alike. However, responsibility is divided. The outcome is not disputed. The memory of Mesopotamia was carried out of a museum in boxes while armies stood in the city. Now pause and listen to the echo, because this is the rhyme at the heart of our entire story. In 1258, the books of Baghdad went into the river, and legend made the water run black. In 2003, 745 years later, the books and archives of Baghdad went into the fire, and this time there were cameras. The two events are not equivalents, and history is not a wheel. One was a massacre that killed a large share of a city. The other was the unraveling of order in a war whose toll came afterward, year by year. But the specific wound rhymes, and Baghdadis heard the rhyme instantly, because it struck the exact nerve of the city's identity. A city built on knowledge, losing pieces of its knowledge. Again, while soldiers stood in its streets. Two decisions taken that would shape everything after. The occupation authority formally dissolved the Iraqi army, sending home hundreds of thousands of armed, trained, suddenly unemployed men, and barred members of the Ba'ath Party from public life, stripping ministries, schools, and hospitals of experienced staff. Both orders were defended at the time as necessary cleansing of the dictatorship, and both are now widely judged by historians and by many former officials themselves to have fueled the insurgency that followed. Within months, bombings began. The United Nations headquarters in Baghdad was destroyed in August 2003, killing its chief envoy. By the following year, the coalition was fighting uprisings on multiple fronts, and Baghdad's neighborhoods were sprouting concrete blast walls like a new architecture. The occupation formally handed sovereignty to an interim Iraqi government in 2004, and Iraqis voted in real elections in 2005. Ink-stained fingers held high for the cameras, an image of genuine courage. Since the polling stations themselves were targets, a constitution passed, a parliament sat. These things mattered, and they were bought at fearful cost. But beneath the new politics, something older and darker was gathering. The bombers had learned that the fastest way to break the new Iraq was to strike not at soldiers, but at the country's deepest communal seam, the line between Sunni and Shia that centuries of history had drawn and modern politics had inflamed. In February 2006, they struck it directly, destroying the golden dome of one of Shia Islam's holiest shrines at Samarra, the old 9th century capital north of Baghdad. The explosion killed almost no one. It did not need to. It was aimed at the country's soul, and it found its mark. Chapter 13. The Years of Fire. There are wounds in Baghdad's story that came from outside. The Mongols, Tamerlane, the bombs of distant coalitions. What happened between 2006 and 2008 was different, and many Baghdadis will tell you it was worse. The city turned on itself. Historians call it a sectarian civil war. The people who lived through it mostly call it simply the bad years, and many will not talk about it at all. After the Samarra shrine bombing in February 2006, reprisals began within hours, and then reprisals for the reprisals, and then the machinery of neighborhood killing took on a life of its own. Sunni extremist bombers, including the group then calling itself al-Qaeda in Iraq, drove explosives into Shia markets and funerals. Shia militias answered with abductions and executions, and death squads, some operating from inside the new state's own security forces, according to wide reporting at the time, swept Sunni districts at night. Every morning, the city's police collected bodies from the streets and the river, dozens on the worst days, bound, tortured, unidentified. The Tigris, the river of ink, became for 2 terrible years a river that carried the dead. At the peak, in late 2006, the United Nations reported thousands of Iraqi civilians dying per month across the country. With Baghdad, the epicenter, total civilian deaths for the whole war era are still debated, with documented counts reaching into the hundreds of thousands and statistical studies arguing for more. As with 1258, we report the range honestly. The precise number is contested. The catastrophe is not. The city physically transformed. Concrete blast walls, 12 feet high, went up along markets, mosques, and whole district boundaries, turning neighborhoods into walled islands, mixed areas, where Sunni and Shia families had intermarried and shared streets for generations, unmixed at gunpoint, family by family, until the map of Baghdad was resorted by sect. Millions of Iraqis fled the country or were displaced within it during these years by United Nations estimates. Among them, a huge share of the professional class, the doctors, engineers, and professors a recovering country needed most. It was the old Baghdad curse in modern form. The city keeps losing its educated to catastrophe, the way other cities lose buildings. And in the middle of the inferno came the attack that this story cannot leave out. On March 5, 2007, a car bomb exploded on Al-Mutanabi Street, the bookseller's street, the narrow lane named for a great 10th century poet, a modern heir to Baghdad's ancient bookselling tradition, the street where professors had sold their libraries to survive the sanctions. The blast killed dozens of people by reported counts, wounded many more, and burned the bookshops, pages drifting over the ruins. Of all the thousands of bombs of those years, this is the one that echoes loudest through our story, because whether or not the bomber thought in these terms, it was aimed at the oldest idea in Baghdad, the idea that this city reads. What happened next is the reason this chapter does not end in darkness. The booksellers came back. Within months, stalls reopened along the scorched street, and the street was formally restored and reopened by the end of 2008. The famous literary cafe at its head, the Shabandar, which lost members of its owner's own family in the blast by widely reported accounts, opened its doors again. The old man keeping his dead son's photographs on the wall above the tea drinkers. Writers held readings in the rubble. The Friday ritual returned, crowds filling the narrow lane for books. And it continues today. Remember the founding legend from the beginning of our story. The circle marked in ash and set alight. Baghdad has always answered fire with stubbornness. The wider war also turned. Through a combination of factors, analysts still weigh. An American troop surge in 2007. The revolt of Sunni tribes against al-Qaeda's brutality. And ceasefires by major Shia militias. By 2009, violence had fallen steeply, and American forces formally withdrew from Iraq at the end of 2011. Baghdadis allowed themselves to breathe. Cafes refilled. Weddings returned to the riverbanks. It looked, briefly, like the end of the story. It was not. In the summer of 2014, a force that had regrown from the ashes of al-Qaeda in Iraq, now calling itself the Islamic State, or ISIS, stormed out of the Syrian war and seized Mosul, Iraq's second city, as whole army divisions collapsed. Within days, its leader had declared a caliphate, deliberately stealing the ancient title of al-Mansur and Harun al-Rashid for a regime of massacre and slavery. Its forces advanced alarmingly close to the approaches north and west of Baghdad, and the capital filled with volunteers rushing toward the front after the country's senior Shia cleric called the nation to arms. Baghdad itself never fell, but for months it lived on the edge, burying sons from battlefields uncomfortably nearby. While ISIS bombers kept reaching into its markets, the war to destroy that false caliphate took 3 years. A coalition of dozens of countries, and the near-total ruin of Mosul before Iraq declared victory in December 2017. And then, at last, the guns quieted enough for something almost forgotten to make itself heard in Baghdad. Ordinary life. And with it came a new generation. Born after the statue fell, raised entirely inside the aftermath, with little patience for the excuses of their elders, and a blunt question they began asking out loud in the squares of the capital. After everything this city has survived, who is it actually for? Chapter 14. Baghdad. Today, the city that remembers. Come back now to where we began. Stand on the banks of the Tigris in Baghdad tonight and look around. Really look. Because after 13 centuries, after everything you now know, every ordinary thing you see is quietly extraordinary. Families are strolling the corniche along the river, past ice cream shops and juice stands. Young couples take photographs under the string lights on Abu Nuwas Street, named for the mischievous poet who drank and joked in the court of Harun al-Rashid 1200 years ago. Restaurants serve mazgouf, the river fish grilled the way this city has grilled it for as long as anyone can remember. The traffic is loud. The electricity still falters in the summer heat. The politics remain tangled, and the peace remains imperfect. But the dominant sound of Baghdad today is not gunfire. It is traffic, music, and argument. The eternal sounds of a big city being a big city. And what a city it has become again, at least in scale. Metropolitan Baghdad today is home to roughly 8 million people by common estimates, one of the largest urban areas in the Middle East. Measure that against our story, the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid, the giant that awed the medieval world, would fit inside the modern city several times over. The town that European travelers once mistook for an impostor wearing a famous name is now, once again, one of the great capitals of its region. It has even been collecting honors. In 2025, Baghdad held the title of Arab tourism capital, and the city used that year to accelerate work on roads, parks, and its historic center, projects that continue today. Measured against the wounds in this story, a tourism campaign might sound like a small thing. Measured against 2003 or 1258, it is astonishing. The deepest change, though, is generational, and you can read it in a single statistic. Iraq is one of the youngest countries on earth, with a median age in the low 20s by international estimates. Most Baghdadis alive today were children or not yet born when the statue fell in Firdos Square. They have no memory of Saddam, and for many of them, even the bad years are a story their parents will not finish telling. This generation made itself heard in October 2019, when huge protests, led overwhelmingly by the young, filled Tahrir Square in central Baghdad for months, demanding jobs, services, and an end to corruption and sect-based politics. The state's response was often brutal, and hundreds of protesters were killed across the country by widely reported counts before the movement was dispersed. But something in the country's conversation shifted and did not shift back. The young of Baghdad had announced, at terribly cost, that they intended to be citizens of a country, not foot soldiers of a sect. Whether the political class delivers remains an open question, and this story will not pretend otherwise. Corruption remains, by every serious index, one of Iraq's heaviest chains. Armed factions remain. The recovery is real, and it is fragile, and both of those things are true at once. But walk with me one last time to the place where this whole story keeps returning. A narrow, car-free street near the Old Quarter, just under a kilometre long, running down to a statue of a 10th century poet gazing out over the Tigris, Al-Mutanabbi Street, a modern heir to the book-selling tradition that once filled the stationer's market of the Golden Age. The street that sold books under the Ottomans, under the British, under the kings, under the dictator. The street where professors sold their own libraries to survive the sanctions. The street the car bomb tore apart in 2007. It was rebuilt, and then rebuilt again, renovated end to end, and reopened in December 2021 with new stone underfoot, fresh paint, and fireworks over a city where explosions in the sky had finally come to mean celebration. On any Friday morning now, you will find it packed shoulder to shoulder. Students hunting cheap textbooks, old men playing chess, poets reading aloud, booksellers laying their stock on tables in the open air. Translations of American bestsellers stacked beside centuries-old commentaries. At the head of the street, the Shabandar Cafe, open since 1917, serves tea beneath the photographs of the sons lost in 2007, while the room beneath the photographs roars with conversation. There is an old saying in the region, quoted sometimes with a smile and sometimes with a wince. Cairo writes, Beirut publishes, Baghdad reads. The saying survives because it keeps being true. This is the answer Baghdad gives to its own history. Conquerors burned its books, and legend says the river turned black. Tamerlane raised towers of skulls. Plague emptied it. Empires traded it. Sanctions starved it. Bombers burned its bookshops, and looters emptied its museum. And after each catastrophe, with a stubbornness that at this point in our story we have to call an identity, the city went back to the same handful of things. The river, the tea, the argument, the books. Cities are not their walls. Al-Mansour's round city has vanished so completely that archaeologists cannot even agree on its exact footprint beneath the modern streets. Cities are not their rulers. Caliphs, sultans, boshas, kings, and presidents have come and gone. 37 Abbasids alone. Cities are the things their people refuse to stop doing. And for 1300 years, through the brightest golden age and the darkest weeks in their history, the people of Baghdad have refused to stop reading. The city that was once the center of human knowledge never actually surrendered the title. It just kept the proof on a quieter street. So what do we carry away from 13 centuries on the Tigris? Carry this. The modern world likes to tell its history as a straight line from Athens to Rome to the Renaissance. This story is one of the missing chapters. Knowledge has never traveled in a straight line. It moves like a relay, passed between civilizations, and for several remarkable centuries. One of the great exchange points of that relay stood on this riverbank. Algebra carries the Arabic title of a book written here. The algorithm carries the mangled name of a man who worked here. The digits on your screen passed through here on their long journey from India to the world. Hospitals, libraries, and houses of research belong to many historical lineages. In Greece, Persia, India, China, and beyond. And Abbasid Baghdad remains one of the most important chapters in that shared inheritance. The West received a fortune through this city, not because anyone hid the fact, because the heirs rarely stop to read the will. And carry one more thing. 1258 and 2003. 7 centuries apart. Echo with the same brutal lesson. Knowledge is among the easiest things in a civilization to destroy. A library burns faster than a fortress falls. But Baghdad's whole existence argues the other half of that lesson. Knowledge is also among the hardest things to kill. Books drowned in the river, and the ideas inside them were already in Cairo, in Cordoba, in Latin translations working their way toward the Renaissance. The House of Wisdom is gone, and historians still argue over what exactly it was. What is beyond argument is what it symbolizes. A moment when human beings poured an empire's wealth into learning, and the current from that moment never stopped moving. Some of it is running on the device you are using right now. A circle marked in ash beside a river. 1300 years ago, by a ruler who believed a capital could be drawn like a diagram and filled with everything worth knowing. Empires rose on it. Armies broke it. And it is still there tonight. 8 million strong. Lights on. Kettles boiling. Bookstalls waiting for Friday. The city of peace has rarely known peace, but it has never stopped being the city that reads. Thank you for taking this journey. The library of history is deep, and there are more doors to open. We will see you at the next one.